Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer to international news, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika and let's head into our first story. Pakistan was plunged into a constitutional crisis on Sunday as Prime Minister Imran Khan called for early elections after the Deputy Speaker of Parliament blocked a no-confidence motion against him on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. Prime Minister Imran Khan on Sunday dodged a vote of no confidence when the Deputy Speaker, a member of Khan's ruling party, refused to hold it. Qasim Khan Suri claimed there was foreign interference in the attempt to unseat Khan. Pakistan's Supreme Court adjourned the hearing in the dismissal of a no-confidence vote against Prime Minister Imran Khan. That's the latest on this development. Now, Prashant, thank you for joining us on this story. It's an ongoing development. Considering Imran Khan did not have enough numbers in the no-confidence vote, how do you see this situation developing in Pakistan?
Right, Swastika, it's complete chaos. There's no other way to describe it because we've seen basically a crisis of parliament, a crisis of judiciary, crisis everywhere. So now the latest, of course, is that the Supreme Court of Pakistan is hearing what happened on Sunday.
Yeah.
And what happened on Sunday, like you said, is this. It's very unique development probably, where a no-confidence motion against a sitting government is not admitted because it apparently is unconstitutional to do so. Now, this is a very creative reading of the Constitution because the government says that there are attempts by foreign powers, and specifically the US, that's what Imran Khan has said, to unseat him. And since Article 5 of the Pakistani Constitution says that everyone must be loyal to the Constitution and to the country, basically what the creative reading involves that this is an attempt to unseat the government by a foreign power, and so the no-confidence motion cannot be admitted since it's against Article 5 of the Pakistani Constitution, which talks about loyalty to the country and the Constitution. Now, like I said, this is quite unique in terms of legislative procedures. So no wonder that the opposition is very angry. They've taken the matter to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court initially said they would announce a verdict today. That's Monday. Now they've moved it to tomorrow. What the Supreme Court is hearing is another question, a related question, whether they have the right to intervene in a parliamentary procedure, because according to Pakistan's constitution, certain aspects of the parliamentary procedure are beyond the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court's call is primarily going to be whether they can intervene or not. And then we'll see what happens after that. But like you said, on the other hand, there's been a parallel track. Imran Khan has basically called for fresh elections. So this is basically been the trump card he was talking about. Basically, he's used the claims of a foreign conspiracy to upend the opposition's plan. The opposition, I think, was fairly convinced that they would be able to defeat him in the no-confidence motion, and then we would see what would happen. So what Imran Khan has done is he's basically taken the initiative from the opposition's hands. He's called for fresh elections. There will be a caretaker government. If the Supreme Court does not intervene, there will be a caretaker government. Probably closer, it might be someone closer to Imran Khan for all which gives him some kind of an advantage as you go towards the fresh elections. And then he can go to the electorate claiming that the country and its establishment the opposition and its establishment have been conspiring against him, and he's this kind of lone warrior fighting for Pakistan will basically be his campaign slogan. So very interesting developments as far as Pakistan is concerned. Very difficult to predict how the next few days will go. A lot will depend on tomorrow's Supreme Court verdict, of course. But assuming the court does not intervene, this gives Imran Khan basically a bit of a free check in terms of a free hand in terms of running the campaign in the coming months as well. And he will probably go all out, like I said, on this campaign plank.
But he is also looking to not have enough support from the masses. I mean, the opposition has also said that this is one of his ploys to stay in power. How do you see this political turmoil unfolding?
Right, Swastika, so we need to understand there are two sets of crises here. One, connected crisis, of course. One is, of course, the political crisis, which you're talking about. That's of governments and elections. And there it's a bit difficult to predict because there are a lot of players which have, their own vested interests here. We of course note that the most important player in Pakistan is the military establishment. Let's be very clear about it. So Imran Khan for the longest time was a poster boy of this military establishment. They majorly aided him in coming to power because the military did not want some of the opposition older parties which were earlier in power to come back. So they were an integral role in Imran Khan coming to power in 2018. Now the fact is, over the years, this relationship has ruptured, which means it looks like the military no longer does back Imran Khan. And this is also clear in some ways from the Chief of Army Staff statements on the war in Ukraine, for instance. The Chief of Army Staff condemning the Russian attack, whereas Imran Khan was in Russia on the day the attack began. That's February 24th. So, those are some of the reasons. Imran Khan has been saying that there's a US conspiracy. He probably means that the US is working with the military, which has long been its ally. Of course, whether it's true or not, nobody knows. But the fact remains that the military establishment is one important sector. Then there is the opposition. Then there is certain parties in the political spectrum which are very closely tied to the military. So all these factors are very difficult to sort of predict. The important thing, of course, is that from the left and progressive forces, many have been saying for the longest time that this is really a bit of a manufactured crisis, that this is just various elements of the political establishment being pitted against each other, the military playing its role as a puppeteer and trying to execute its will. Whereas the second crisis is really the larger social and economic crisis we're talking about. The economic crisis, of course, inflation at a very high rate. Pakistan has been forced to go to the IMF with a begging ball. That too, the IMF has been very unhappy that Pakistan, the Imran Khan government, introduced subsidies on fuel, for instance. They didn't want that to happen. So there is a huge economic crisis. There's a social crisis, increasing extremism, for instance, on one hand, especially the right-wing extremism, Muslim fundamentalist parties playing a key role in that. So that, of course, there is no real solution. Neither the government, which is interesting because I think we'll be talking about Sri Lanka next, and that's very similar in the sense that neither the government or the governing structure or the opposition parties really have much of a alternative or any kind of creative solution or effective solution to all these crises. So it just looks like a lot of jockeying for power between these two sectors, between these two forces. There is not much, unfortunately, not too much hope for Pakistan's people, it looks like at this point.
And from one South Asian country in crisis to another, Sri Lanka's cabinet ministers have resigned en masse after protests over the government's handling of the worst economic crisis in decades. A severe shortage of foreign currency has left Rajapaksa's government unable to pay for essential imports, including fuel, leading to debilitating power cuts lasting up to 13 hours. Ordinary Sri Lankans are also dealing with the shortages and soaring inflation. There is deep anger against Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's handling of a deepening economic crisis. There have been protests and clashes with the police that took place last week. Let's go over to Prashant. If you could tell us a little bit more about the new cabinet that has been sworn in and the old cabinet that has resigned. Now, the swearing in of the new cabinet, what are the implications?
Right, Swastika. So as we know, the Sri Lankan cabinet resigned except for Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, who is the brother of the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. In fact, there were a lot of Rajapaksas in the ruling dispensation until the resignation, of course. But the new cabinet is a very small cabinet, just 4 ministers, including the Minister of Finance. Okay. This itself has caused some tension because one of the partners of the ruling alliance itself is very unhappy, according to reports. Meanwhile, protests continuing unabated in the country. We know that there was a 36-hour curfew that ended today morning. The impact of that is still there. Nonetheless, despite the curfew, the fact remains that people took to the streets across the country. The anger is widespread across sections, across communities. There's this demand that the Rajapaksas resign. There's a very deep unhappiness, like you said, with the way this whole crisis has been handled. And it's important to note that this is because the crisis actually hits at the essentials of life in Sri Lanka. It's food, it's fuel, it's medicines that are not available or that people are struggling to access. We're talking about long queues. We're talking about the currency crashing. So in every aspect of life, this impact is being felt. And it's not surprising at all that people are taking to streets in such large numbers and expressing such dissatisfaction. And the other side of the issue, of course, is that the Sri Lankan government really seems to have no clue on how to handle this, because this is a long-term crisis. We've talked to many experts on this before. This is a crisis that has been long in the making. So it's not that there is some kind of magic bullet to sort of tide over this crisis in 1 minute. So except for asking for loans from, credit from India, from China, there are plans to negotiate with the IMF, but all this will take some time. So as far as the immediate crisis is concerned, there really seems to be no particular solution. So right now, the option before the Rajapaksas seems to be to sort of try to, like I said, you have a new cabinet, you try to make some announcements, etc., etc. On the other hand, there's been repression happening. Like we said, we saw there was a curfew, there have been arrests, there was a social media blockade apparently, according to various agencies, which was then reversed. So all in all, we see an establishment, and the Rajapaksas are a very integral part of this establishment. So this whole establishment under a deep threat, under a deep crisis. So the coming hours and days are going to be very vital. By the time, yet again, like in Pakistan, by the time this show comes out, we don't know what really is going to change or how things are going to look different. So very difficult time for Sri Lanka as a whole, and especially, like I said, because the fact that there doesn't really seem to be a solution in sight.
You said that this was a crisis that was in making for a long time. What is the root cause of the economic crisis, Prashant?
So yeah, there are many root causes actually. I mean, I think one of the experts we spoke to, Ahilan Kadragamar, had pointed out to People's Dispatch that while this is actually comes from the 70s almost, there's a very long systemic series of policies in which Sri Lanka's economy was more and more financialized, so to speak, which is actually leading to this crisis. 2 or 3 key moments, of course. One is the COVID-19 pandemic, which destroyed some of the key aspects of Sri Lanka's economy. We're talking about the exports, we're talking about tourism, we're talking about the migrant workers, many of whom lost their jobs. So all those sectors were badly hit. Secondly, if you look at the fact that shortly after coming to power, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2019 announced a tax cut. So that reduced the revenues that the Sri Lankan state was getting, and this really not clear why. And even more disastrously, we're talking about a decision in 2021 to scrap the use of chemical fertilizers and only have organic fertilizers. Now this really affected the food production in the country, and we are seeing the impact of some of those shortages now. So there's of course the Easter bombings as well, again, which affected tourism. So a variety of triggering points here really for the crisis. But the larger policy framework since the 70s, especially since 2009, where Sri Lanka has again and again gone to the IMF, it has adapted its policies. In that way, it is not really focused on agriculture, the food economy. It is not really focused on improving production capacities, which means that a lot of its essentials have to be imported. So these deep-rooted structural issues in the Sri Lankan economy are have all sort of crystallized, have all sort of converged at this point and led to this crisis. So this is which is why we keep coming back to the fact that there is no real immediate solution in sight. If there's a massive credit inflow from India or China, or from the IMF, again, going to the IMF has its own problems, because the IMF was that line of thinking was what caused the problem in the first place.
They decide the agenda.
Exactly. And like our expert was telling us, I mean, both the ruling party and the opposition, their only solution is really the IMF. So it's not that the opposition, which is heavily involved in these protests, actually has any kind of different economic framework in mind. They have pretty much exactly the same ideas. So overall, like I said, it's a very difficult time, and no real clarity on how things might pan out in the coming days as well.
Thank you, Prashant. Do stay with us for the next story. Now, moving on to our next story, Amazon workers have successfully unionized the company's JFK 8 warehouse in Staten Island, New York, forming the first US union at the company. This victory not only has a major implication for the success of the organizing efforts in other Amazon warehouses around the country, but it will surely inspire workers at other major corporations to organize their workspaces and rebuild working class power. Now, Prashant, how did workers of this one particular warehouse organize against such a giant corporate?
Right. So there's a longer history of organizing across the US and Amazon. We'll come to that. But this warehouse specifically is interesting because in 2020, we had this a worker called Christian Smalls who protested on COVID safety. And then a couple of days later, he was fired citing COVID violations. And, he was made the face of this sort of, this kind of a notion that labor organizing was pretty much, was an antisocial activity kind of a thing. So over the past 2 years, especially since April 2021, there has been consistent organizing by present and former workers. And they have been organizing with a lot of challenges. Let's be very clear about that, because Amazon has spent millions of dollars in 2021, for instance, on what is called union busting activities. So what are these union busting activities? These are consistent efforts made by Amazon to convince workers, or say consultants employed by Amazon to convince workers that unionizing is a bad idea. So they spread all kinds of rumors about how this this will actually endanger your jobs, how this is against the ethos of the company, how all you need to do is negotiate with Amazon, which is a good employer, etc., etc. So the workers, on the other hand, of course, had no real financial means. So they had a very small budget which was raised entirely through donations. But nonetheless, the fact remains that finally, when the vote took place, the number of votes in favor of a union was around 2,600. The number of votes against was around 2,100. So this is a massive victory. Although it's just one warehouse in Staten Island, this is a massive victory nonetheless for workers for Amazon in the United States and the world, because this shows that this is the Amazon Labor Union, that's what it's called, and this actually shows is a precedent that you can actually successfully organize and form a union. Now in the US, you need to form the workers need to vote to form a union before the union can negotiate with the management. So this union, of course, has important demands: $30 per hour, considering that the cost of living in New York is so expensive, pensions, childcare. One key aspect they're asking for is the fact that if there is a natural disaster, the warehouse should be shut down and the workers should receive pay. And we know that some months ago in Illinois, workers died because Amazon did not shut down the warehouse in time. So at a time when there are so many more natural disasters, this is a very important demand. So all in all, a very surprise. Nobody expected it, actually. A lot of the media said that this was a doomed attempt, considering the amount of effort Amazon was seemed to be putting to actually prevent this from happening. But a very small, scrappy set of organizers managed to fight back. So a very interesting development, and it will definitely have a lot of implications across the world.
Actually, staying with the implications, how will this impact other Amazon workers and other warehouses in the country, in the US, and across the world?
So we do know that a similar effort is going on in another warehouse in New York. We saw that Bessemer in Alabama, there was a organizing effort some months ago. It did not work. Again, they face many obstacles of this sort. For instance, there are lots of reports of the kind of obstacles union organizers made. But I think globally, there is a powerful movement that is building up. So we do know that last year, for instance, Make Amazon Pay was a campaign that was conducted by organizations across the world. It is very interesting to note because we had unions in Europe, we had garment workers in Asia, we had workers in the United States. Their point was Amazon is everywhere and so are we. Right. So and they had a lot of common agenda to raise, which actually quite similar to some of the agenda points raised by this union as well, which is one, the fact that Amazon pays a pittance in taxes, considering how rich a company it is. Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world. Amazon, one of the top 5 companies in the world. Its worth reached, I think, $1 trillion during the pandemic. And it's one of those companies which actually did well during the pandemic. But if you look at these demands, for instance, the fact that there has to be childcare, there has to be pensions, there have to be better contracts which don't leave their work at such a precarious way. So all these, I think, are demands that people across the world are raising against Amazon wherever they're working. So this, I think, will be watched across the world as a very interesting moment in organizing. It's a sign that this can be done.
Yes.
And I think that this will actually serve, it will have a domino effect in many places. And it's important to note this because Amazon is not just, American company or US company anymore. It's a global force.
Yes.
And there are many other global forces like this as well. Companies which have so many branches across the world, companies which are global entities, companies whose net worth is more than that of certain countries' GDP even, right? But companies which nonetheless continue to employ workers at atrocious contracts. There's no other way of describing it. Their workers are basically subcontracted. They have extremely bad working hours, horrible conditions. There is no concrete nature in terms of employment or benefits. So this question is time and again being asked, that considering that you're such a rich company, why is it that your workers are among the most, are really so badly paid, are really so badly treated? And I think this chant, this set of demands will over the years keep increasing, and Amazon and companies like this, which have such a global footprint, are going to face more and more such pressure. In the United States itself, we are likely to see, like I said, more such organizing, because once workers also see that it is possible, then, and some of the methods used here are very interesting, because the organizers in Staten Island spent a lot of time in individual contacts, in sort of the nuts and bolts of organizing. It is not about big speeches, or it is not about big promises. It was actually the old school, one-on-one focus, planning, and convincing their fellow workers that it was their right, and they should actually take up these rights. They should actually fight for these rights. And this is not some kind of privilege that you're getting as workers, but ultimately what is what you deserve. So I think this will be really closely watched, and maybe in many other areas also they might actually take it up and use similar methods. So interesting times ahead for both Amazon and Amazon workers. Amazon will definitely have to sort of, Amazon and Jeff Bezos definitely have to sort of ask themselves that while it's excellent going to space, but what do you do with those who are responsible for your creation of your wealth on Earth? How do you treat them as human beings? Absolutely. And decently?
Absolutely, Prashant. Thank you for joining us with those details. Do come back on Daily Debrief tomorrow and do follow us on People's Dispatch. Thank you.